Hey geeks, Barry here with Geek Out Studio, and today I'm going to show you how I painted my Age of Sigmar Lord of Plagues. Here's a list of the paints that you'll need. Be sure to pause if you need to see it. So after priming it with Vallejo Surface Primer, I started with Vallejo Model Air Olive Gray. After that, I went with a zenithal highlight, starting with Vallejo Model Air Hemp, and then from directly above, finished it with Vallejo Model Air Duck Egg Green. I gave it all a gloss coat to protect the paint, and then to get some more of a grime streak looks to it, I brushed over it with AK Interactive Streaking Grime. Gave that about 30 minutes to an hour to dry, and then I just kind of streaked it using a dry Q-tip. Now for the skin, I followed pretty much Citadel's paint scheme. So I started with a thin layer of Kislev flesh, and then I'll go and use Reikland flesh shade, but I thin it down slightly. So, but you'll see this gets a complete coverage. Wounds, intestines, everything gets covered with Kislev flesh. Like I said, here I'm doing Reikland Flesh Shade. I thinned it down very slightly with just a generic acrylic thinner. But again, same thing. This goes over everything. Once that's had time to dry, I'll then actually work more with glazes and very thin paint to work back up. Here I'm starting with Kislev Flesh. Again, I thinned it down with a combination of acrylic thinner and glazed medium just to give it a little bit of translucent, and I can build a more natural, I think, a more natural skin tone. Or at least as natural as Maggotkin Nurgle worshippers can get. And from there, I'll actually then, I don't think you can really see it, but after that second layer of Kislev flesh, I then just start using more and more thinner layers, starting with a combination of Kislev flesh and Vallejo game color pale flesh. Again, thinned down with glazed medium and acrylic thinner, and I'll just work up from that mixture then to just Vallejo game color pale flesh, and then a final kind of highlight of pale flesh and palette witch flesh, and then just straight palette witch flesh. Now for the actual like horns that are growing out of his shoulder, I just I followed GW's guide, which is it's just Xandri dust. I'll hit it with Seraphim Sepia, but I'll thin the Seraphim Sepia down. And from there, I'll build back up with thin layers of Screaming Skull, and then I'll do a brown wash to build in some of the darker tips. So here I'm putting on the Seraphim Sepia. And then next will be the Screaming Skull. And what's great with the horns is it's okay to actually kind of leave streaks. So you'll see I'm working and just kind of flicking the brush up and down. That'll give that more bone-like texture to it, I think. Now I'm going to apply a brown wash, and this can be pretty much any brown wash. And just like what GW does, is I'll start keep it thin, and I'll start low, and then I'll drag it to the tip, let that dry, and then again keep just building up layers by dragging more and more of the wash to the tip. Now, here for the skull, like the couple of skulls and the rags, those both start with a coat of not Reichland flesh shade, Rackart flesh. And the skull I will shade with Seraphim Sepia, and the rags, like his loincloth rag and everything, I'll shade with just a brown wash. So here you can see I'm just shading the bone skull with Seraphim Sepia. And like I said, I'll shade the rags with a brown wash. And to highlight the skull and the few bones, I just use Screaming Skull, or you could use that or Vallejo model color buff. I didn't go with a clean white skull because, again, this is Nurgle. They're going to be kind of dingy, not clean skulls. Now for the wood and everything, I'll base coat it with Citadel's Dryad Bark, and then I will do a dry brush of Folk Art Barnwood. It's a really great paint to get like an aged, old, weathered wood look. So I'll dry brush it with that. Once that's done, I will then do a dry brush Terminatus Stone. So here I'm doing the Folk Art Barnwood, and then I'll do Terminatus Stone. And then you can do a thin wash over that of brown, just to kind of maybe tie it all together if it's too light. So here I'm going back and shading in the rags. Once that shade's done, I'll just highlight the rags with a combination of Rackart Flesh and white. And all the metal gets treated the same way. So the little bit of chainmail in his axe blade, it gets painted with Vallejo game color gunmetal. You can use bulk gunmetal, yeah, any kind of just generic metal. And then after that's dry, I'll coat it with a gloss coat, and I will weather it using pigment powders. but I will give it a brown wash first. Now to get the, there's a little drip coming out of his stomach. Most people paint it as like poison or something, but I went with actual like blood. So to do that, I use Vallejo Model Air Camo Black Brown. That'll give a good blood effect. And then for the pustules, you can go kind of either way. For me, I did like a combination of Vallejo Game Color, Plague Brown, and Ivory, and then I just kind of worked up the Ivory from there. So here I go to the weathering for this, and the actual blood effect is the last thing I do. And for this, I just mix a little bit of alcohol with Secret Weapons, Light Rust, Orange Rust, and Red Rust, and literally just mix the pigments on the blade itself. That's a great way of giving like a more natural rust effect. And then I'll go back, I don't think I got it on camera, but then I'll go back and dry brush it with a little bit of the gunmetal, just to bring out some of the sharpness on some of the edges again. But you can see I put the rust effect on all the metal. And then the very last thing is blood for the blood gods and all of the wounds and everything like that to give it a nice gross festered appearance. And that's pretty much all that went into them. So really great model. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Hope it helped. Here are a couple of stills coming up. If you liked this, let me know. If you have any other comments or questions, leave them down in the doobly-doo down below. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button, and I'll see y'all next time.